Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a smaller group for indicators 10, but for today at this time, we are going to have our special education indicator focus group for indicator 10, specific disability categories. And today for our region, it's going to be the speech language impairment, ID and ED that we're looking at. The areas of focus for today so that we just know what we're going to be going over. We're going to go over accessing the special education profile, which I think both of you have already walked through that because we've done a little work already. Review of the timeline, which we know some of your timeline has passed. I know you've already done some work. And then indicator overview. We're going to unpack some of that, completing the self-review summary report, completing the improvement plan, systemic improvement, and evidence of completion for the improvement plan activities. And then just finish up with some tips for meaningful and successful indicator required actions and our next step planning. We also, again, just want to share that if you have an ESC partner or another third-party partner that's helping you with this, such as your speech and language pathologists, if they are not within your district, just remember that when we go over this profile that they don't have access to this, your ESC partners don't. So if you want them to be part of the team and understand the data with you, you'll need to share your profile and your indicator data with them. So the first part we were going to go over was accessing the special education profile, about how you access that and you look at the information for the required actions. I'm going to skip over this just for a moment and show you what we're going to do next. And then I think when Holly goes on to look a little bit deeper into the profile, we can do that all at once so we're not jumping around. So when we do access your profile, just remember that this is the icon or the tile that you're looking for is the special education profile and ratings so that we can look at where your required action is.
All right, so Lydia, do you want me to take over from here?
You can. I was getting ready to pull that up. It might be easier for you to pull up and walk through.
The profile? Perfect. Yeah. So let me see here. Share my screen. So I know for some of you this is going to be redundant. Can you see on my screen the OHID application screen? Awesome. So accessing the special ed profiles and ratings, we'll go into that application and go ahead and log in. And again, I know some of you already know this like the back of your hand, but we'll go ahead and we do have a sample district that we're going to pull up. And take a closer look. And so as you scroll down between the different categories of questions as it relates to this phase 1 release of the special education profile, we're going to go down towards essential question number 6, are children receiving equitable services and supports? And as Lydia mentioned earlier, our districts in our region, although there's these different categories of disproportionality, all of our findings within our region occur around identification and specific to the categories of speech language impairment, intellectual disability, and emotional disturbance. And so, of course, we see the not met tab here, and as we kind of click open kind of the action, you'll see all disability categories listed first and foremost. And I'm going to scroll here where you'll see intellectual disabilities identified. You'll see emotional disturbance identified for this particular sample district. And I think that's it, but sorry, look away here if I'm making you dizzy. We'll look at this very first category of intellectual disability, and they're looking at Black for the subgroup. And so one of the things that we know is we have to click into that little plus box, and that sometimes hangs people up in terms of recognizing that there's more things to release. And so what you see here is kind of the data in graph form across the past 3 profile years. And remember, we're kind of a year behind in terms of reporting of data. But as you look at the profile, it gives you kind of those data notes in terms of what we're looking at for the specific measurement, and how they label it here is really thinking about that over-identification in this particular category of intellectual disabilities. So we would know for our specific region those categories that are specific to us. They clarify the use of the risk ratio calculation, and we know that that is, I guess, the measurement of choice when we think about disproportionality. And so they give you a breakdown in terms of how this was calculated, and they do put the clarifier. This includes students with and without disabilities, including students ages 3 through 21. It wasn't until the past 2 or 3 years that we included preschool children in this calculation. So they go on to clarify that dividing the risk specifically for Black students in this case to be identified under ID or intellectual disabilities by the risk for students of all other races to be identified in that same category. And so we're using the full-time equivalent of Black students identified divided by the total full-time equivalent of Black students enrolled in the district times 100. So they actually lay out the calculation. And then the risk for the comparison group, again, the full-time equivalent of all non-Black students in the district identified under ID divided by the full-time equivalent of all non-Black students times 100. And then the risk ratio equals the risk for the racial group and then the risk for the comparison group. So they kind of lay that out there for you, and indicating further that those districts who have significant disproportionality is all based on the risk ratio in order to meet the requirement for this particular indicator. We know that districts are going to have to look at their policies and procedures and practices all around evaluations and how they're identifying students to determine is this really an issue of just over-identification, or as they indicate, inappropriate identification? And then the result of the risk calculation has been shortened in the data table, which you can look at the targets specifically from 1920, with the target being less than 2.5. Let me scroll here a little bit so you can see. And so for this particular district, we were at 3.28. In 2021 reporting period, they did drop down to 2.85. And then for the third year, 21-22, they did go back up to 3.0. One thing that I would want to mention, and I know this has come up for certain districts, I'm going to click over into the Equity and Special Education Disproportionality site on ODE's website. And if you're wanting more information about business rules for disproportionality, there is this technical document that kind of outlines specifically for students or where those students are counting. And on page 8 of this resource is you can find additional information in terms of where they're counting. And if you bear with me just a moment here, look away. This technical document gets more deep in the weeds of the specific calculation. And as I scroll further here, you can see under eligibility, the calculations. So again, students 3 through 21. We're looking at for this particular aspect of disproportionality with and without disabilities, and then students counting with their legal district of residence, which is the district legally responsible for providing FAPE or a free, appropriate, and public education during the school year. So in case there are questions, you have that.
I dropped that link in the chat. Amy, this is the one that I had sent you last week when we were discussing whether you had a data reporting error to submit for. And we're a small group. So if Jude and Amy, if you guys have questions, please just stop Holly or I, and we'll answer this as we go along.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So it goes on to talk more about the calculation. I'm going to jump down here to this bullet. Your district does not meet the minimum cell or N size for the comparison group. So then we look at this other calculation, the alternate risk ratio calculation, which oftentimes in our rural districts, that's kind of that number then we begin to look at. So we're comparing the risk for the racial group within the district to the risk for the students of all other races in the state. So now we're bringing in those numbers from Ohio. And then this second bullet, the alternate risk ratio, uses the district level risk for the racial group in the numerator and the state level risk for the comparison in the denominator. So you'll see that number reflected often in terms of our rural district or districts. Your district has had a risk ratio greater than 2.5 for 3 consecutive years. And so when we look back up at this graph, that's kind of what that blue line is helping to reflect. Well, I'm sorry, this 2.5 line kind of gives us that threshold. And then it goes on to clarify in order to meet the criteria for reasonable progress, we're looking for 2.5 for 2 consecutive years decrease. And so that's kind of what this blue line then is representing as we're looking for that, that decrease of 0.25. So that's just a little bit about the calculation itself. And we can go down here and it lays it out step by step for you. So you can see it captured there. And then in this particular example, they show the reflection of the reasonable progress. They made 0.43, a change of 0.43, and had that occurred in year 2, 0.25 or greater, then they would have not have received that flag for disproportionality. So clarify that. And then as we scroll further, look away here. So it's not, I guess we can't look any further at the specific actions. So I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. Bear with me here. So in the profile, you have direct links to the manual. And in the manual, it outlines all of the different levels of required actions. And this looks different across our districts in terms of what's required moving forward. And we know that for indicator 9 and 10, there is this very first submission of records for the timeline of January 13th. And our special ed team has already been in contact with districts who were required to submit records. So we can kind of check that off our to-do list in terms of those records. And what we will be awaiting is further clarification as a result of those records that have been submitted. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. And then the next timeline that would be listed in your special ed profile would be the completion of the self-review summary report, as well as the improvement plan. And those due dates again, March 31st. And that's where our SST colleagues, our school improvement colleagues will be helping to support districts with these steps of required actions. And we'll be talking about these pieces, and some of you we know are already familiar in terms of these steps. And some of you are new in your positions to the districts that you're serving. So we'll make sure that anything that has been submitted in the past, that we know how to access those documents. And then this next step, 512, is real important. And it correlates to our January 13th timeline of those record submissions. Any of those records that were submitted back in January that were found to be non-compliant by OEC, those evaluations will have to be completed again to address all of those areas of correction. And we all know that you can't amend an ETR, so they will require a reevaluation. So we'll talk a little more about that.
When will, oh, sorry, can I ask a question? When are we most likely to see those back? As far as when will we know if, certain ones need to be redone or if they've approved those 5?
So I can't remember off the top of my head the exact lag time in terms of when we were notified as a district, kind of making it through that process. If I get an opportunity, I'll kind of go through some of those emails and see if I can determine. I don't know that, when they're looking at records, they're looking at records across the state. So it varies in terms of, I can't give you like a hard, fast answer, but I could kind of give you a roundabout based on our districts who have had to do that. And one of the things that we were hoping, I guess, is that for some of you, you wouldn't have to submit records again this year, but as it was explained by Shauna Schramke, that very first year that districts are required to submit records, that second year of the finding oftentimes is not enough time to address systemic issues. So they kind of give you a little grace period to adopt or put in motion some of those activities, because you know as well as I know the timing. When we look at March 31st as the improvement plan, there's not a lot of time between then and then the beginning of the school year or early fall to really see much change. So we had a district that this is their second year of findings, so they did not have to submit records, but there are some of you who have been through this process who now again are requiring to submit. So we'll try to narrow that time frame down after we maybe look at some emails. Amy.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Sure. And then that last step of September 29th, we're going to look at your improvement plan activities and submit all of that evidence. And then there may be another round of student record submissions, and we'll talk a little more about that as we kind of move through the PowerPoint. And then the possibility of student records just to address systemic improvement, or a statement that there were no developed ETRs that were part of the specific time frame that they have identified. Lydia, is there anything else that I should have covered in terms of the timeline or the manual before we get into the self-review summary report?
I don't think so, just because I know that Amy had already addressed the submission. Jude didn't have to submit.
Okay.
So I think we're okay.
All right, I'm going to share my screen again. Bear with me.
And I see Jamie's on. Hi, Jamie.
All right, so here's the self-review summary report. And one of the things that the department has kind of drilled repeatedly is, as you're in your special education profiles, is to download these documents directly from your profile. And so looking kind of at the cover page of the self-review summary report. Sorry, let me catch up with my notes here. One of the things as a starting point is to think about your district self-review team. You will be the team members will, be working through the questions as it relates to disproportionality. So if you've not started this process, or you're new in your position in terms of kind of starting from ground zero, it's really getting familiar with the content of the questions. And when we think about the finding being around your evaluation processes, thinking about who is involved in your evaluations at the district in terms of who might you want to be included on that team. So from our school psychologist, our related service personnel, our intervention specialist, thinking about some of our partners. Remember that these numbers do include preschool. So when I think about speech language impairment, are we operating our own preschool program and/or preschool services? So, do we need to include our ESC partners? So all of those team members that we might want to think about including on our team. Says a consultant from the district's regional state support team and general ed partners must be part of the district self-review summary report. So even thinking about, they clarify further here who those individuals could be. So our building principals, gen ed teachers, central office administrators. Thinking about all of those individuals. And I will take a moment just to kind of scroll through here for just a moment. The steps are clearly outlined in terms of how you would move through this document and the guiding questions. These topics would be, for those of you who have more than one finding, these topics, of course, will be different than your other indicators, but you'll see a very similar setup in terms of the guidance. So we're using those data gathering questions to think about all of our systems that we currently have in place, especially around evaluations. And, by going through each of the questions, it helps us then to analyze the data based on all of our responses. And in terms of completion, they give you a clarifier in terms of the involvement of the state support team. Once the district team has reviewed all of those questions, we're going to use the data summary box to help us summarize. And so you can see down here within the sections of the self-review summary report, it's divided into two sections. Section A for any district who has data reporting errors, which then goes on to section B, where you can see the question begins with a reflective question. And these would be for districts who have had required actions around this indicator for the previous 3 profile years. And if you have more than one finding in a particular disability category, you will have to do individual self-review summary reports and improvement plans for those. And then recognizing that the information that's gathered could be very similar when you think about some of the processes that are involved. So you have a place to record your responses, and then an area to reflect the summary of data, and then a place under area of concern where you're going to identify, is this an area of concern, yes or no? And for all areas that are identified as a yes, you'll establish root cause. And in our PowerPoint, we have a slide that kind of references those root cause aspects and specific tools that could be used for determining root cause. And then there's a section for identifying priorities. So for every question that was marked yes as an area of concern, then we're going to rate each one of these areas from 1 to which, how many of our other areas that you said was a priority, with 1 being the highest. And so all of those steps that I just kind of went through are outlined 1 through 8 in the manual. So this tool will be loaded into the monitoring application, which we'll kind of show you later here in the presentation, and we'll go directly to the OHID portal to show you that. But to go through the topics for this particular indicator, sorry, I should have stayed there instead of making you more dizzy. There was the reflection process questions, and then it goes on to talk about intervention prior to referral for evaluation, tiered supports for item 6. So thinking about those systems that you have in place. And then item 7 is all things related to assessment and those considerations as you're selecting assessments, and then your planning and evaluation team is number 8. Number 9, we start getting into specifics of disability categories and the selection of those. Item 10 is around culturally responsive practices. And then 11, investigation of records. And then what will happen as records are being provided to OEC, they will provide kind of a sheet, if you will, that kind of outlines all of their specific guidance and recommendations in terms of what were some of those areas of concern and or non-compliance. And so we'll use that information to address item 11. And so that kind of wraps up all of the topics from that particular, for this particular indicator. And just by glancing over it, I didn't see anything that was hugely different from previous years outside of the item 11 and the investigation of records topic. Are there any questions about the content of the questions? Have everyone, have you looked at these yet, or is this the first time viewing?
Amy, do you have a question?
Mm-hmm.
I was a part of the team in viewing it the last time, but I'm viewing it from a different seat right now. So I guess where do I put this? Like, where do I type this information? Like, if I want to say all about the assessment tools that we've updated in our district, I know it may sound silly, but I don't know where do I put it in that data summary spot? So I download this from, my special education profile that was sent to our district. And then can I type right in there, Lydia?
Yeah, so I'm typing right now.
Oh, okay, I see. All right. So yeah. I can answer the question right after the prompt. Okay, thank you so much.
And you know what, Amy, I know because this is your first time kind of being the leader, right? Because all of these emails are coming to you. It's okay. And Holly and I think it might be on another slide we're talking about. It's okay to give this to your team before you meet whoever you identify as being on your team. It's okay to let them know these questions. Just be upfront. These are the types of questions we have to answer and decide because you're going to go through it and answer the questions, and then you're going to decide if it's an area of concern, and we're going to talk about that. But it's okay, because you might have things in there and someone else, another team member, come to the table and say, oh, but this is what we're doing. So it's okay to do some of that pre-work and get your thoughts together so that you all can discuss it and then craft it exactly the way that you want to answer as a district.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
And another, when we think about team members, this has come up in the past too, and we know every district union is a little bit different, but it might be something to consider to have somebody from the union participate, just to due to contractual issues, and I think just helping to understand what this process is all about, because there will be some things that will change as a result of this. So having those conversations first and foremost. We've had a district who have created a Google Doc, just kind of a cut and paste of these questions, and having staff or your team members type into the document just for some honest feedback. That has occurred because a director felt that maybe people would hold back during a face-to-face meeting. So she used that type of format. So this can look very differently across the board in terms of how you elicit responses to the question. But that data summary piece, that's really where you want to make sure that especially the SST are involved with that, and you've got your team involved with the data summary.
And Amy, just because you asked the question, I wanted to further, since this has been completed for your district before, you've put some special education procedures in place. So the answer, you can pull up last year's to see what was submitted, because some of that information might be the same, but we still will want to make sure that we're pulling the most, the most current data. And that's why we say when we talked about the team that it might be it might not just be you, it might be your EMIS coordinator, it might be whoever's helping put the input on the IEPs, because we'll want to use the most current data. And I think that some of your answers may be slightly different than what they were in the past, just because you have taken steps to put procedures in place. So we'll need to go back and look and, what does your procedure say about evaluations and, interventions prior to, because that may impact some of your data summary and your processes that you're reporting here.
Yeah, and even this topic 4, that's where going back to your previous plans will be helpful in terms of addressing what's working, what's not working. Was it fully implemented? We all know that life happens and sometimes things don't get implemented as intended. So that's where those will come into play. And I even think about the differences between the categories that we're talking about. If you've been identified as emotionally, or a finding with the category of emotionally disturbed, I think of my team even maybe including some of those behavior specialists. And, so really thinking about the category too, sometimes with our students who are identified speech language impaired. Do we have folks from our early intervention teams, just some of those different aspects that we talked about earlier, and the importance of having a gen ed person represented on your team too, so that they understand the aspects of evaluation planning. So, all right. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. This was exactly what you just saw from that self-review summary report that was downloaded from the profile. And then we talked a little bit about root cause analysis, and our purpose when we identify those concerns is to really help us drill down to those specific underlying causes. What are those things that are beneath the surface that are really contributing to our area of concern or our specific finding? Oftentimes it's more than just one thing, right? There's many things, especially when we think about evaluations and eligibility determination. There's lots of different factors to think about. So these are some of the different methods that could be used. Fishbone, 5 Whys, a combination of those things. There may be existing methods that your district leadership teams are already familiar with, already using, but just know that for this purpose, OEC isn't saying you must use one particular method. So and even thinking about the timing of your meetings and data collection, oftentimes thinking about one more meeting causes us to go gray, right? So what other teams do we have in place that maybe we could gather some of this information and do some of this data analysis? And then here is the improvement plan. And many of you who've already completed an improvement plan in the past, this will look very familiar. And it looks like over time, we kind of get better about fine tuning these plans from the OEC lens. But you can, again, these documents downloaded directly from your profile. You can type right into those documents. And if I didn't say this before, if you're using a format, a large group meeting, sometimes it is nice to identify somebody to type in that document for you as you're having those conversations. I don't know about you, but I'm not always the best at typing and listening and being a participant. So that might be helpful to do that. But so you can see at the top of the box, you can indicate which particular indicator you're responding to. and there's a spot to reflect your you're summarizing your areas of concern. There's a spot for that reflection question for those of you who have had findings within the past 3 years. There's a place for you to record a goal that is more long-term in nature, that we would want to think more beyond the profile timeline, and then your short-term goal that would be more specific to the timeline of your special education profile. And then below here, you will find, oops, scrolled too far. You'll find the specific activities. And so, as Lydia referred to earlier, the review of policies, practices, and procedures, that is, I guess, a non-negotiable, if you will. That will be something that you will have to do. And so for those of you who have been building your special education procedures, maybe there's things that we need to tweak or add. And then from the investigation of records, are there specific activities, thinking about training? And then item 4, there's a spot to record any additional activities that maybe don't fall in those first 3 line items. There's a spot for you to record all of your resources, and so when I think about training, oftentimes we think about universal supports, we think about Ohio's operating standards. SST is usually a resource that's listed. So just to give you some examples of what potential resources may be outlined there. Timelines, they give you the timeline of September 29th in terms of all of the activities that have to be completed. But remember, this plan has to be developed and sent in by the 31st of March. But you may have some activities that are completed prior to September 29th. That question has come up in the past. Can I submit it prior to the September 29th deadline, or should I submit it all at once? And that really is a local decision. You can decide what that will look like, but all must be submitted by September 29th, and we'll kind of show you in the slide and hopefully in the OHID portal where that is. Completion, that's all of the evidence that you will upload into the monitoring application. And so as you're developing your activities, one of the things to think about is what can I do, or what can we do that is easily demonstrated through evidence that would be pretty easy to upload. And then those would be things that would be entered into that monitoring application. This improvement plan is a little bit different. This is all specific to disproportionality, but you have the opportunity to indicate, will this specific activity be supported with those IDEA Part B funds, 15%, which have to be reallocated to those early intervening services. It's okay if they're not, but they just give you the option to reflect it here. And I'm going to scroll down here. Well, of course. Here, we're going to identify and describe the target population and characteristics that result in the students being included in the group to receive these services or these early intervening services. And this part is new. This did not exist last school year in terms of it being embedded within this plan, to my knowledge. And then the next section of allowable activities to be funded with redirection of IDE Part B funds, you're going to just select where those activities or what outside of the activities could those funds be used for. And before I leave this plan, if you're concerned about the redirection of funds, and we do have some fiscal guidance documents that many of you have probably already seen that kind of outlines for us what can be used and what is not allowed to be used, kind of in a department created reference document. So we'll kind of pull that up. And again, many of you are already familiar with that. But if you have specific fiscal questions, you'll see Mark Linsky's contact information, as well as Randall Kempton. And I've only interacted with Mark. He's pretty good about getting back to you in a pretty timely fashion. Below are all your spots that you're going to capture those required signatures. So the person who's going to be implementing this plan, the treasurer, and that might be somebody who you also have on your team as part of working through those questions. I know I didn't always have the luxury of having my treasurer attend things, but because of the redirection of funds, that would be a good person to keep close, the superintendent, and then for our community schools, a spot for the district sponsor, and then our state support team signature.
Holly, since you did mention that when we have a community school and the sponsor school, so it's important if that's the case, that we are inviting all of those required people who can help make those determinations about redirection of funds, because it may not lie just on one person. Also, if a district or a community school would have disproportionality in maybe more than one area, would that look any different for them rather than a district who's only disproportionate in one area as they're completing their documents?
Say that one more time, Lydia, I'm sorry.
So if a district or a community school has multiple disproportionality findings, would that look any different when they're completing their SRSR and their improvement plan?
So they have to complete separate ones for each category. Sorry, I did say that earlier, but now that we went through it, it probably is
Yes.
prompting.
A question came in, and I just wanted us, since we're recording this, so that we all can go back. So if a district would have an indicator finding in disproportionality, let's say they had SLI and they also had an ID, so they can't just complete the process once, even though it's all under indicator 10. They'll need to complete a separate one for the SLI and then a separate one for the ID.
Yes.
Okay.
But only 15% in all, correct? Only 15%. So then I have to disperse it. Is that correct? I don't get 15% reallocated for this finding in this one. It has to be 15% split, correct?
That's a good question.
I'm pretty sure.
You only have one. You only have one, Amy, so we're okay.
Okay.
But we can look and see about that.
So this is the fiscal guidance document, and it is on the same page that we or Lydia linked earlier. And I'm going to scroll down here, kind of look away if this makes you dizzy.
So Lydia, whenever I choose while she's scrolling, like as far as things we feel, because we've made a lot of changes, like you said, but we're going to have to approve more changes. Are you willing to look at those ideas as before yes, I'd appreciate it.
So at least your school improvement consultant or myself, since we've been working, we can talk about that. Remember, your SST consultant needs to be on your team and we'll have to sign off on these documents. So yes, we will have to look at that before you decide.
Okay.
Again, I would go back and see what you all have done in the past, because we have to say, like Holly said, what's worked, what hasn't worked. I know that this portion on the plan looks a little bit different than the past, but you already have had to do redirection of funds, whether it was to strengthen TBTs, BLTs, such, how we were looking at data, that kind of things. But we're going to have to assess whether that's appropriate, and that's what we're going to keep doing for the redirection. Mhm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I did pull up the allowed versus not allowed services. So as you start thinking about your self-review summary report, there will be conversations, I know, in terms of, what are some good things to think about after we've drilled down to, root cause and determined what those root causes are. This will kind of give you some guidance in terms of what is allowed and what's not. So I don't know, I make this a little bigger. Don't know if you can see the red, never allowed, green, always allowed, and then the yellow check, allowed, special requirements or additional information as needed. So they kind of give you, starting on page 3, we'll scroll through here, pages of what's allowed and what's not. So that document will be useful in terms of having some of those conversations. I know some have used these funds for supplies, materials, specifically for those preventative practices, not so much for students with disabilities, but those things that we're going to do to be proactive when we think about intervention supports. Teaching staff has been utilized in terms of implementing interventions. I think those are the big things that I can think of. And Lydia, I don't know if you can remember off the top of your head, professional development, a lot of Haggerty for speech language impairment when we think about those early literacy skills and connections to our students who are resurfacing, with articulation errors, and recognizing the importance of phonemic awareness, phonological awareness.
This is just another reminder when we're looking at this chart that if we are a Title I school, definitely our federal programs people, these are all very important people when we're making these decisions that can tell us, hey, we already do this, or hey, we need to do this. And when we're making these decisions. Because we can give you examples, but it's going to be specific to what your district needs. And when there's gaps in your services or gaps in professional learning, which will result, we'll be able to hopefully dive down into that when we're working through the root cause and the areas of need.
This is Jill. Can I bring up a question? And maybe it's in here because I have not read this document entirely. I'm wondering when it talks about that the school district and community schools are required to redirect 15%. Does that mean redirect as in that we're going to support, not supplant, such as, a service that we're already using that might not be working, we can't list as something that we're already spending the funds on? Do we need to actually show redirect that this is something new that we're going to try?
So, yes. And, one of the, I guess, one of the things that we've had lots of conversation around is oftentimes these funds in discussion some want to use them specific to students with disabilities. And so the conversation becomes, well, let's think about what is something that we can do differently, thinking about those proactive preventative services so we don't get to that point of needing to refer. and you said something, Jill, and I lost it already in my response back to you. It'll come back to me.
Again, my question was, is this the same redirect as to supplement and redirect our funds, not to supplant what we're already doing? Such as, like, I just glanced down and saw coordinator salary. If you're already paying a coordinator salary out of your federal special education funds.
And so this did happen at one of our districts, where what they proposed to do was to provide her with different, or I guess additional responsibilities, like when students would come to the district, she had more of a role in that enrollment process and collecting information and doing intake outreach kinds of things. And one of the things that I would encourage throughout this document is, like, when you're looking at doing things like that through staff, often it requires additional documentation to verify that, yes, that time was spent doing those kinds of things, whatever that might be. And like I said, that was one case that I can think of, that one of our regional districts, and I believe it was approved for them. But any of these kinds of questions, I would run directly through Mark Linsky, or our fiscal contacts, just to be clear. So we're not losing that 15% of funds. It's just now it all has to be directed towards early intervening. I don't know if that specifically answered.
And Jill, I would say, just kind of to piggyback on that, it will be speaking with the district's federal programs person, because they sometimes have a little bit better idea of what's in place and how it's being. I know when we talk about supplanting, that's usually not what they want to go for. But I mean, you have to talk to them and look back at documents. And like Holly said, if we ever have a question, I would just email them directly.
And is Jude still on?
Yes, we're still on.
Hey, Jude, I wonder, could you share, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but just because I kind of remember, did you use some of those funds for parapros?
Correct. And now with a new leadership in our financial office, we're saying that we need to follow up with this new person to make certain that I'm going to share this checkmark list and make certain that he's on board with finalizing this fiscal piece. But yes, so we designated, per our last financial leader, that to have our parapros pulling out and doing helpful intervention group sessions with anyone that's on. We had speech interventions groups that we created. So that's what we're using ours for. And what are you needing me to share, Holly?
No, that I couldn't remember all of what, and I thought there was an instance of staffing that would kind of, in my eyes, align to Bill's question.
And we also are sitting here determining that we still would like to send home some speech packets to anyone that's in the speech, being looked at for speech. We'd like to do some sort of home-based activity that the students we could send home now that we have a speech consultant working with us. So we're probably going to talk to our treasurer about adding some resources as well.
Okay.
So
Sorry.
Jade, could I ask a clarifying question? This is Jill Sheridan, and I'm learning this for the first time as well. So in that allowable last year with those paraprofessionals, were those paraprofessionals additional new supports, or were the pull-out interventions additional assignments to those paraprofessionals?
Each building is working with their teams. Of course, we've had several new people coming to our district, but only the ones that are able to provide that intervention. So we didn't hire new per se, but we did make certain that they could work with that team at the building level to pull out those groups.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. I think that went back to a little bit of what Holly's example was.
And I did find in the fiscal document, I don't know if you guys are still, if I'm still showing that on my shared screen. What are funding parameters for coordinated early intervening services, supplement, not supplant? There is no supplement, not supplant requirement for state or local funds. Funds are coordinated early intervening services may be used to develop and support an MTSS of instruction and intervention, but may not be used to support the implementation of core instructional activities. It looks like it's on page 3. All right. So, these are just all of these are very general guidelines for completing the improvement plan. And like I said, this is very general guidance. This would apply to each one of our indicators. So you'll find very general information here that we kind of already went through. And I should go back. Did we get through? Yeah, we did. Okay. And of course, there was the fiscal guidance that we just kind of reviewed in terms of acknowledging those allowable versus not allowable supports. In terms of the monitoring application, this is just a screenshot that appears in your manual. And this will be the application that I find is, if you run into trouble, this is usually the spot, navigating it for the first time in terms of uploading information. And that Shauna Schramke, our OEC consultant who is supporting all of the work under the special education profiles, she would be the one that we would want to alert in the event that we upload documents into the monitoring application, because it doesn't automatically generate an email response to her. So I always think it's wise to email her and just say, hey, just wanted to make you aware that I have uploaded documents into the system. So let's see here. I can. Oops. So here's the monitoring application once you get into the system from the portal. Since I've been out for a while, it's going to make me go back in. And once you're in there, you can go to special education program monitoring. Let me move some things around here. And you can put a district name in there. And Jude, if you don't care, just for our purposes, and do a search. And when you scroll down, you can retrieve the district that you're looking for. And then this little page up here in the left-hand corner with the tabbed down,
Mhm.
you can kind of see all of the different documents that have been uploaded for the district in the past. So if you have existing documents from previous findings, that's kind of how you can retrieve those. And that's where you should also be able to get feedback from the department. There's a spot for comments. There's different communications. So there's different aspects within this tab that you can access. Like I said, that's usually the toughest thing, is just getting information uploaded. This is just more about individual corrections. And this is the part where it will be your special education consultants, Tiffany, myself, or Lydia, who would be doing this part where we are going to be looking at those individual corrections prior to you submitting those. So you can see districts and community schools should work with their regional state support team to ensure that corrections are completed in a compliant manner. And one of the things that we try real hard to do, recognizing that sometimes we're just limited with our time, but when we look at records that need to be corrected before submitting them, it's helpful to do that before you actually go to meeting with the parents. So if there's still things that need to be corrected, we have the opportunity to do that before you go to meeting and then have to do another evaluation. So, you know, since we're dealing with evaluations, correcting ETRs, just making sure that we have all the needed signatures, and providing all of the required documentation. And this last blurb, and I always hate when they use the word amended, meaning ETRs can't be changed without doing a reevaluation. So in order to make those necessary corrections. Does that make sense? But we know that that's not going to happen to anyone in our region, right? But May 12th is that next big timeline that you would want to flag. And then in terms of record submission, this is the specific form that we would want to be using, and it outlines all of the instructions here for you. We're going to use one submission per indicator. And it's not one of these forms per record, but all of the records for that one particular indicator finding. And then you're going to upload the student records to this doc upload site. And then making sure that we're uploading each student's required record items as well to the same doc upload site. So we don't have to worry about redacting records. It's all, since it's going to the secure site, then we don't have to worry about that. Lydia, anything else that you can think of in those two?
No, just again, we just have to be mindful if we are making sure our files match up from that record submission form. And when we submit, the file name should match what it has. And it gives you the example. So if you had, you know, the first student and you put their SSID in there and you put it, so you would name that record 1, indicator 10, record 2, and then make sure you keep track of that. Everyone is human. Sometimes there's been mistakes, and we've had to say, hey, this said we didn't have OT signature on record 2, but my record 2, there is no OT. So when we communicate back and forth, even though they are redact, you don't have to redact them, like Holly said. That's how they communicate. This was record 1 of indicator 10 or record 2 of indicator 10. So just being mindful of that, because clear, concise is kind and less errors.
So thinking about systemic improvement, we go back to this monitoring system for the evidence that we have to upload, but also this other layer of systemic improvement. Just a special note, if there were areas of non-compliance when we submitted those records, there's this other aspect or other layer. You have to select 5 evaluations for each disability category where there was non-compliance that were found during that investigation of records between May 1st and September 22nd. So this is a small window of time, and potentially you might not have any records or evaluations that occurred. If that happens, then you're just going to send a statement into that monitoring system that indicates there were no evaluations for that particular disability category within this given time frame. And then you're going to provide all of the SSID numbers on that student record submission form. And then you will also, you will also compile the items that are listed below there, A through E, and make sure that you've got a label that corresponds to the number on your student record submission form. So the ETR planning documentation, your consent for evaluation, documentation of the student's race, ethnicity, which is usually some EMIS documentation, and then any other supporting documents. And then using the submit button on the student record submission form, we'll set up an email to send the document to this particular link for the profile. And then it clarifies that you're going to upload documents, the student records, to the secure upload site. So that's one aspect that makes this indicator a little bit different. And then these are just more of those general tips to help you be successful through this process. Just making sure that you're accessing the appropriate forms, and for districts who have more than one finding, some of the forms do look similar, but they are different, especially when we think about indicator 12. That's a separate office that some of those forms will be sent to. And they give you some tips for the investigation of records and record submission, which investigation of records, we don't have to worry about, that's already occurred. And then just navigating the monitoring system. They want you to be mindful that that's not the place to upload personally identifying information for our students. That occurs on the secure upload site. The self-review, summary report, and improvement plans, just making sure that we address all of the specific areas on those forms, and make sure that you have those needed signatures. Individual corrections, just making sure you hit those due dates. If that's one thing that I could reassure you to do, is to mark that somewhere in multiple places so that you have those close at hand. And then systemic improvement, those Google Forms are not accessible to OEC, so that's under that kind of second bullet there. We did put our contact information and then links to our staff directory. You know, not everybody has had an opportunity to meet our school improvement consultants who are going to kind of help in many aspects of the process to help move us forward. And they're going to be reaching out to you in terms of kind of setting up some of those times to kind of think about our self-review summary reports and our improvement plans. And so just kind of some of those reminders in our next steps is marking our calendars, thinking about those big looming due dates that'll be here before you know it, thinking about who you're going to have on your team, kind of using those questions from your self-review summary report to kind of guide, and thinking about your disability categories that you were flagged for will help. Recognizing the coordination of the meeting times with our SST colleagues, securing all of those forms and resources that are kind of linked and embedded in your profile. Use those forms directly from your profile, and then thinking about those self-review summary report questions that you've put your eyes on, or you know, what data sources might be helpful in terms of completing those questions. And I think those were the big things that we wanted to make sure that we covered with you. Are there any questions, reactions, whether it's our districts or our SST colleagues?
Well, the PowerPoint, I want to thank you, is very helpful, and I think it will help help me stay organized and provide me a guide to my next steps. I'm sure you're sharing this with me, and I think it's going to be beneficial. So thank you.
Yeah, what we plan to do, Amy, is make sure that the PowerPoint and then the recordings are sent out as quickly as possible, knowing the deadlines that you're under. And we know that not everybody was able to participate. And if you're like me, sometimes I just need to hear something more than one time. So
Me too.
it's a lot of information. We will stick around for a few questions. Otherwise, that's kind of it for our presentation.